Hello everyone, and welcome back to If It's Math. Today we're going to be talking about the quadratic formula, which is a very important concept in algebra that helps make life a lot easier. And in this video we're going to cover the following topics. First, what is the quadratic formula itself? Second, in order to help in learning how to use the quadratic formula, we'll do a little bit of a refresher on quadratic equations themselves. And once you've done that, we'll go through the specific steps to using the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation. Then we'll do several examples of how to use the quadratic formula, some that are straightforward, some that get a little more complicated if you have fractions in the answer, for example. Then the last thing we'll go through is how to utilize the quadratic formula when the answers have square roots, because those get pretty complicated. So we'll go through an example of that as well. Then if you're interested, there is a bonus video for the quadratic formula that we have, looking at how you actually derive the quadratic formula. So we won't go into that in this one, but if you're interested, look for that bonus video. So the first thing we'll talk about is what is the quadratic formula and why is it really important for you to learn how to use it. So when we think about the what behind the quadratic formula, what it is a formula that calculates the solutions to a quadratic equation. So at first it might not seem apparent why that's important, but then when you really do take a look at the why that's important, it gives you a fail-proof way to easily solve any quadratic equation. So no matter what the quadratic equation is, if you know the quadratic formula, you can solve it without knowing any of the other methods that you can use to solve a quadratic equation. So before we really jump into what is the quadratic formula, it's important that we do a bit of a refresher on quadratic equations themselves, because we'll be talking about that a lot during the video. And if you need a more in-depth review of quadratic equations themselves, be sure to check out our quadratic equations video. But just as a quick refresher, a quadratic equation is an equation where the highest exponent on a variable is squared. So the biggest exponent is a 2. So if it goes beyond that, it's not a quadratic equation. So for example, x squared. As long as that's the highest power that you have on a variable, then you're in a quadratic equation situation. So we're not really going to be talking about graphing a lot today, but I think it's important to understand the graph behind quadratic equations to show you what's going on. So when you draw a quadratic equation, you get a parabola. And when you talk about solving a quadratic equation, it's to find those two spots where the parabola crosses the x-axis. Okay, so then if we want to really get into how we're going to solve a quadratic equation, there are, some important things to think about. But really, if you think about that graph again, it's what x values are going to make the quadratic equation equal 0. So that's what we're trying to figure out. If you say solve a quadratic equation, what x values make that equal to 0? So there are a lot of ways to write out quadratic equations, but you'll almost always need to get it into what's called standard form. And what that is you get everything on one side of the equation and have 0 on the other. So the general form for that is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So let's go through what the quadratic formula itself really is. So when you think about the goal of the quadratic formula, it's to provide an easy way to solve any quadratic equation, which again means to find where those values of x equals 0. So there's an important wording issue there that I just wanted to touch base on briefly, and that's quadratic equation versus quadratic formula. So we just talked about those quadratic equations, which again, remember, is an equation where the highest exponent on a variable is squared. That's what makes it a quadratic equation. But on the other hand, what we're talking about today is the quadratic formula. And so what makes it a formula is that it's the process or the formula that you use to calculate the solutions to a quadratic equation. So you use the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation. So it's kind of important to know when someone asks you about using the quadratic formula, that's what you're doing. Okay, so now we've got all that cleared up. Let's really dive into the kind of intimidating looking quadratic formula. So it's minus b plus minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. So there's a little song. If you look it up, you can find it, and it'll show you how to remember that. So we're going to use it a lot today. So let's get into how you actually do that. So the steps used in the quadratic formula, there are 5 of them. So first you're going to want to rewrite that quadratic equation in standard form. So that's step 1. Step 2, you plug in the numbers, so the a, b, and c. You plug into that quadratic equation, or quadratic formula. Then step 3, you calculate the 2 solutions. Step 4, you write the answer as 2 equations. The answer to quadratic formula has to be written as equations. Then step 5, and again, this is what I love about math. You can go back and check the answers to make sure that you're right. Okay, so the best way really to learn how to use the quadratic formula is to go through some examples. So let's take a look at a straightforward example to see how this works. So for this example, let's use, say, 3x squared minus 12 equals 2x squared plus x. So if we needed to solve this equation, step 1 is to rewrite that quadratic into standard form. So let's go through that process now. So we start out with 3x squared minus 12 is 2x squared plus x. So the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and get the 2x squared from the right side of the equation to the left. So we'll subtract 2x squared off both sides. That will leave us with x squared minus 12 equals x. Then we need to get that x on the right side, or the correct side, so the left side. So we'll do x squared minus 12 minus x is x minus x, which gets us to what we need of x squared minus x minus 12 equals 0. So a is 1, b is minus 1, and c is minus 12. That gives you that a, b, and c that you're going to need. So in this example, like where you see the x squared, if there's no number in front of it, it's going to be a 1. So step 2, let's plug those numbers in the quadratic equation. So here's that formula again. So when we plug in, we've got, again, b is minus 1, a is 1, and c is minus 12. So this is what all that comes out to be when you plug in those numbers. Then step 3 is to go through all the math to calculate out those 2 answers. So let's go ahead and walk through that. So let's rewrite what we had here. So we have minus 1 plus minus the square root of minus 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times minus 12 all over 2 times 1. So let's start simplifying that. So that'll give us 1 plus and minus square root of 1 minus 4 times minus 12 over 2. Then 1 plus and minus 1 minus negative 48 over 2, which will be 1 plus and minus the square root of 1 plus 48 over 2, reduces to 1 plus and minus the square root of 49 over 2. The square root of 49 is 7, so this gives us 1 plus and minus 7 over 2. So let's split that out into the 2. 1 plus 7 over 2 and 1 minus 7 over 2. Taking that one step more, that gives us 8 over 2 and negative 6 over 2, or 4 and minus 3. So those are the 2 answers. So it's, again, really straightforward. So step 4, though, you have to remember to write the answers the correct way. So the solutions to a quadratic equation need to be written as 2 equations. So this is x equals 4 and x equals minus 3. Those are the 2 answers. But again, the great thing about math is you can always check your answer to see if you're right. So let's go through the process of checking that. So we'll go back to our original quadratic equation. So we had 3x squared minus 12 equals 2x squared plus x. And let's check that first x answer. Does x equal 4? So we'll plug it in. 3 times 4 squared minus 12, does that equal 2 times 4 squared plus 4? Let's go through the math. So 3 times 16 minus 12, does that equal 2 times 16 plus 4? Does 48 minus 12 equal 32 plus 4? So that gives us 36. Does that equal 36? Indeed it does. So what that tells us is that x equals 4 is a correct answer to this quadratic equation. But that only gives you one of them, so you got to check the other one as well. So let's get back to our original quadratic equation, and we're going to be checking, does x equal negative 3? So 3 times negative 3 squared minus 12, does that equal 2 times negative 3 squared plus negative 3? We'll reduce all that down. 3 times 9 minus 12, is that 2 times 9 minus 3? Is 27 minus 12 the same as 18 minus 3? Is 15 equal to 15? Indeed it is. So we know that x equals negative 3 is the other correct answer to this quadratic equation. So there you go. Congratulations, you got through your first one. So now let's try another that might involve a little more complicated arithmetic. So let's try x squared plus 10x minus 30 equals negative 7x squared plus 14x, or minus 14x plus 50. So the first step we'll do is we're going to rewrite that into standard form. So we've got to start out again. X squared plus 10x minus 30 equals negative 7x squared minus 14x plus 50. So let's start with getting all the x squares on the same side. So we'll add 7x squared to each side of this equation. Then we'll reduce that down, and we will end up with an 8x squared plus 10x minus 30 equals minus 14x plus 50. So we need to get the x's all on the same side now. So we will add 14x to both sides. Then that'll reduce down to 8x squared plus 24x minus 30 equals 50. So we'll subtract 50 off of both sides in order to get into standard form. So now we've got 8x squared plus 24x minus 80 equals 0. So remember, the whole point of standard form is that you need to get that a, b, and c for the quadratic formula. So our a is equal to 8, our b is 24, and our c is negative 80. Okay, so then remember step 2 is going to be that we need to plug in these numbers into the quadratic formula. So here is that formula again. So we need to plug in the 8, 24, and negative 80. And when we plug those numbers in, this is going to be what you end up needing to reduce down to get those two answers. So let's jump right into that then and do step 3, which is where we're going to calculate out those two solutions. So we'll start again with a negative 24 plus and minus square root of 24 squared minus 4 times 8 times negative 80 all over 2 times 8. So let's take that first pass at reducing it. So we have negative 24 plus and minus 24 squared plus 576 minus 32 times negative 80 all over 16. So next step, we will work on inside of that square root and end up with 576 minus a negative 2560 all over 16. Then that becomes negative 24 plus and minus 576 plus 2560 all over 16. So negative 24 plus and minus square root of 3136 all over 16. That becomes negative 24 plus and minus 56 over 16. So we'll break that out into the two solutions. So negative 24 plus 56 over 16 and negative 24 minus 56 over 16. So that's going to come down to 32 over 16 and negative 80 over 16 coming out to 2 and negative 5. So remember that step 4 is now needing to write those as two different equations. Those will be the solutions. So this comes to x equals 2 and x equals negative 5. So that final step 5 is to go back and check those two answers to be sure that they are correct. So we'll start with that original quadratic that we had. So we had x squared plus 10x minus 30 equals negative 7x squared minus 14x plus 50. So we're going to check first, does x equal 2? So 2 squared plus 10 times 2 minus 30, does that equal negative 7 times 2 squared minus 14 times 2 plus 50? So 4 plus 20 minus 30, does that equal a negative 7 times 4 minus 28 plus 50? So does 24 minus 30 equal negative 28 minus 28 plus 50? Does negative 6 equal a negative 56 plus 50? Does negative 6 equal negative 6? Absolutely it does. So x equals 2 is correct as our first solution. So we'll go through that same process again for the other. So x squared plus 10x minus 30 equals negative 7x squared minus 14x plus 50. We're going to check, does x equal negative 5? So negative 5 squared plus 10 times minus 5 minus 30, does that equal negative 7 times negative 5 squared minus 14 times minus 5 plus 50? So that'll reduce down to 25 minus 50 minus 30. Does that equal a negative 7 times 25 plus 70 plus 50? So does negative 25 minus 30 equal a 175 plus a negative 175, excuse me, plus 70 plus 50? Does negative 55 equal a negative 105 plus 50? Does negative 55 equal negative 55? Yes, it does. So that will let us know x equals negative 5 is a correct solution. Okay, great work, everybody. So you've gotten through 2 of them. So now let's just make it a little bit more complicated. So let's do a third example. And in this example, we're going to be dealing with a quadratic equation where the solutions are going to be fractions. So that does make things a little bit more complicated, but let's just walk through it together and we'll get through it. So let's do 4x squared plus 3 equals negative 2x squared plus 7x plus 1. So that's step 1, remember, is that we need to rewrite that equation into standard form. So we start out with our 4x squared plus 3 equals negative 2x squared plus 7x plus 1. So we're going to subtract off, add in actually the 2x squared on both sides so that we get all the x squareds on one side. Gets us down to 6x squared plus 3 equals 7x plus 1. So now we're going to move that 7x to the other side of the equation by subtracting a 7x from both sides, which will get us down to 6x squared minus 7x plus 3 equals 1. Bring that 1 to the other side by subtracting by 1 on both sides. We get our standard form of 6x squared minus 7x plus 2 equals 0. So that makes our a equals 6, our b equals negative 7, and our c equals 2. So step 2, we're going to write out that quadratic formula one more time, plug in these numbers, and then move to step 3. So here's that formula one more time. So we will get negative times the negative 7 plus and minus the square root of negative 7 squared minus 4 times 6 times 2 all over 2 times 6. So let's start working through that in step 3, where remember our goal is to find those 2 solutions by calculating out this expression that we have. So we'll rewrite it just to give us more space. So we have negative 7 plus and minus negative 7 squared minus 4 times 6 times 2, all of that over 2 times 6. So that'll give us a 7 plus and minus the square root of 49 minus 24 times 2, all over 12. That comes down to 7 plus and minus 49 minus 48 over 12, giving us 7 plus and minus the square root of 1. So we got an easy one here, over 12. So 7 plus and minus 1 over 12, which gives us 7 plus 1 over 12 and 7 minus 1 over 12. So that becomes 8 over 12 and 6 over 12. So our 2 solutions here would be 2/3 and 1/2. Okay, so this one's going to be a little more complicated to do that final important step of checking. So before we get there, let's write our answers out as 2 equations. So we have x equals 2/3 and x equals 1/2. Okay, you ready for some fraction work? Let's do step 5. So we're going to check these 2 answers. So again, we're going to rewrite out our original quadratic. So 4x squared plus 3 equals negative 2x squared plus 7x plus 1. We're checking, does x equal 2/3? So 4 times 2/3 squared plus 3, does that equal negative 2 times 2/3 squared plus 7 times 2/3 plus 1? So to square a fraction, you just square both parts. So does 4 times 4/9 plus 3 equals negative 2 times 4/9 plus our, if we go ahead and do that through, we'll get 14/3 plus 1. So remember to multiply fractions. You just multiply the whole number times the part on top. So 16/9 plus 3, does that equal negative 8/9 plus 14/3 plus 1? So in order to keep working on this, we're going to have to get everything into a common denominator. So that's going to be 9. So we'll get everything there. So we'll take that 3 times 9 to give me the 27 over 9. We'll do negative 8 over 9 plus, to get that 14 there, we'll have to do 42 over 9. And then 9 over 9. So common denominator, now we can add everything over. So does 43 over 9 equal, get that 8 and 42 together, we'll get 34 over 9 plus 9 over 9. So does 43/9 equal 43/9? Yes, it does. So we know that x equals 2/3 is a correct solution to this quadratic equation. So let's check that other one. So 4x squared plus 3 equals negative 2x squared plus 7x plus 1. And we're going to be checking, does x equal 1/2? Okay, so 4 times 1/2 squared plus 3, does that equal negative 2 times 1/2 squared plus 7x, which is the 1/2 plus 1. So 1/2 squared is going to be 1/4. So does that equal negative 2 times 1/4 plus 7/2 plus 1? So again, multiply the whole number times the fraction. You get 4 over 4, which is 1. So does 1 plus 3 equal negative 2/4 plus 7/2 plus 1? So does 4 equal negative 2/4? We'll go ahead and do that common denominator of 4 plus 14/4 plus 4/4. Does 4 equal 12/4 plus 4/4? One more. Does 4 equal 16/4? So does 4 equals 4? Yes, it does. Thank goodness. So x equals 1/2 is a correct solution. Okay, so that was a lot. So feel free to go back and watch that again if you need to see those steps. Okay, so if fractions weren't hard enough, let's go through one really complicated example where the answers still have square roots in them. You will get this, especially as you move into Algebra 2 or some higher levels. So let's walk through that. So if we want to try a quadratic equation where there are answers that do have square roots, let's pick the example here of 2x squared plus 4x minus 5 equals 0. So it doesn't look like it's going to be complicated, but it will be. So step one, we're going to rewrite that into standard form, but okay, the example was hard enough to get through, so we're going to do the straightforward piece here. So it was already in standard form, so it gave you a head start here. So a equals 2, b equals 4, and c equals minus 5. So step 2 here is looking at plugging in the numbers. So here's our quadratic formula again, and we're going to plug in our 4, our 2, and our negative 5. So this is what we end up getting with that quadratic formula as we plug in all those numbers for this one. So step 3, and this is where it's going to get a little complicated. This is where we are going to start calculating out those two solutions. And this time we're not going to be able to get rid of the square root. So let's see what happens when that happens. So we'll get negative 4 plus and minus the square root of 4 squared minus 4 times 2 times minus 5 over 2 times 2. So let's start reducing this. We'll get negative 4 plus and minus the square root of 16 minus 8 times negative 5 all over 4. So that gives us negative 4 plus and minus 16 minus a negative 40 all over 4 becomes negative 4 plus and minus 16 plus 40 now. So we get to have that double negative turn into a positive. We get that 16 plus 40 all over 4. Continue that moving down with that all over 4. Then our next step is to get our negative 4 plus and minus the square root of 56 all over 4 again. But now the problem becomes that 56 doesn't come evenly. but we can pull a square root of 4 out of it. So that'll give us negative 4 plus and minus the square root of 4 times the square root of 14, because 14 divided by 4 gives you that 56. So that gives us minus 4 plus and minus 2 times the square root of 14 over 4. So now we can split that out. 2 times negative 2 plus and minus 2 times square root of 14 over 2 times 2, so we can cancel out those 2's. That'll become negative 2 plus and minus the square root of 14 over 2. So we'll have a negative 14 minus 2 over 2 and a negative square root of 14 minus 2 over 2 as well. So that gives you those two solutions. They are pretty complicated. The important thing to remember about square roots is that if you have the square root of a number, you can break it into the two factors, make it multiplied by each other, so then you can start reducing some things out. So step 4 is to write the answer as two equations. So we have x equals square root of 14 minus 2 over 2, and x equals negative square root of 14 minus 2 over 2. So step 5, of course, is to check those solutions. And I'm not going to put you through that in this video. So what we have is we'll have a bonus video on how to check those two answers, because it gets really complicated in that arithmetic. So if you want to see it, check out the other bonus video we have. So that's it. That is really all that there is to the quadratic formula. Thanks again for watching. Hope that it was helpful. Please like this video if it was. Please subscribe to our channel as well. Stay up to date on new content to help you on your math journey. And always remember that if it's math, we have the solution.